If Russia gives Su-57 technology to India, does that threaten China? On the surface, this sounds like a narrow military question. One jet, one deal, one region. But that's misleading. In the same way asking, does one cracked tile matter? Misses the fact that the whole floor might be shifting underneath. Because this story isn't really about a fighter jet. It's about Russia running out of money and options, India running out of suppliers, and China watching the board several moves ahead. It's about who controls technology, who depends on whom, and who can afford to wait. Behind this single weapons deal are much bigger forces, a world drifting away from U.S. dominance toward uneasy multipolarity, old grudges between supposed partners, energy shortages, industrial weakness, and technological choke points that don't show up in headlines. And that's why, honestly, the most surprising part of this story isn't India's interest in the Su-57, it's China's complete lack of panic. To understand why China isn't worried at all, we have to follow the money, the technology, and the grudges, and see how this deal fits into a much larger strategic picture. First, let's be clear about one thing. This Su-57 offer is not a rumor pulled from social media. Russia has officially proposed transferring Su-57 technology to India. India hasn't signed the deal yet, but the key word is yet. Why does this matter? Because timing tells us intent. Putin is expected to visit India in December and, big defense deals are rarely finalized quietly. They're announced during state visits, with cameras rolling and flags in the background. That's when political risk is shared, and when leaders lock in commitments they've already agreed on behind closed doors. Now ask the obvious question, why would India even consider this? Because India has no real alternatives. The F-35 is effectively off the table. The United States doesn't just sell weapons, it sells conditions. Long-term oversight, software control, political alignment, and restrictions on how the aircraft can be used. For India, which insists on strategic autonomy, those strings are unacceptable. Russia, on the other hand, is cash-strapped. It needs export orders to keep factories alive, workers paid, and supply chains running. That pressure makes Moscow far more flexible. Fewer political demands, looser technology controls, and friendlier financing terms. Here's the critical insight most people miss. Russia isn't afraid of India copying its technology. Reverse engineering only works if you already have a strong industrial base. India doesn't. It struggles with engines, materials, avionics, and large-scale systems integration. Russia knows that even if India assembles Su-57s, it will still depend on Russian spare parts, upgrades, training, and weapons. Every Su-57 India buys doesn't make India independent. It locks India deeper into the Russian weapons ecosystem. And that sets up the core irony of this entire story. A deal sold as empowerment actually increases dependence. To understand why India keeps circling back to Russia, you have to zoom out and look at the structure of India's military, not the headlines. Roughly 70% of India's current military equipment has Russian roots. Tanks, fighters, submarines, air defense systems. They all trace back to Soviet or Russian design. That kind of dependence isn't just about what you buy, it's about what you can maintain. Modern weapons aren't like smartphones where you switch brands overnight. They're more like railways. Once the tracks are laid, every train, repair shop, and signal system has to match. Changing suppliers means rebuilding the entire network from scratch. This is why India's purchase of French Rafale fighters didn't change the fundamentals. Rafales are good aircraft, but France simply doesn't have the industrial depth to replace Russia across an entire military. It can't supply India's full range of needs, engines, ammunition, spare parts, upgrades, at the scale and speed required. The Ukraine war did damage Russia's reputation. There's no denying that. Videos, sanctions, and battlefield losses shook confidence in Russian weapons. But reputation alone doesn't replace logistics. When your Air Force, Navy, and Army already depend on Russian systems, you can't just walk away because of bad press. Maintenance cycles, pilot training, ammunition compatibility, and repair facilities matter more than news headlines. A jet that looks impressive on paper is useless if it can't be kept flying. That's the trap India is in. India isn't choosing Russia because it wants to. India is choosing Russia because history left it no clean exit. Now let's widen the lens because this deal doesn't exist in a vacuum. In recent months, reports have surfaced suggesting that the United States and Russia may be moving towards some form of compromise or ceasefire in Ukraine. These reports are not confirmed, but they are plausible, and that alone is enough to shift calculations in capitals around the world. Why? Because even a partial ceasefire changes everything. If the fighting slows, Russia gains breathing room. Sanctions pressure eases at the margins, military production stabilizes, and, most importantly, Russia can start selling weapons again without looking like a desperate pariah. Arms exports are not a side business for Russia. They are a lifeline. They keep factories open, preserve engineering talent, and generate hard currency. The moment the war cools, Moscow will move aggressively to reclaim lost markets. And India is the easiest target. India already uses Russian equipment. Its officers train on it. Its bases are built around it. Selling more weapons to India doesn't require rebuilding trust, just restarting the pipeline. Zoom out further, and this becomes a global turning point, not a regional one. For decades, the world revolved around a US-centered order. Today, that structure is cracking. Instead of one clear leader, we're seeing a messy, unstable form of multipolarity, where power is fragmented and alliances shift constantly. In that kind of world, Russia doesn't need to be dominant. It just needs to be relevant again. And once Russia starts reclaiming that relevance, the question naturally becomes, what does this reset mean for China? From the outside, China and Russia look like close partners. They trade heavily, coordinate diplomatically, and often stand on the same side against United States pressure. But, partnerships between great powers are rarely warm friendships. They're transactions. Here's the uncomfortable truth. China did support Russia during the Ukraine war, but mostly in the economic sense. Trade increased, energy flowed east, and Russian oil found buyers. What Russia wanted, however, went further. In the military and technological realm, China holds things Russia urgently needs. Advanced electronic components, manufacturing equipment, and key systems that modern weapons cannot function without. Yet, China kept its distance. It avoided crossing red lines that could trigger secondary sanctions or long-term strategic costs. And well, that restraint was noticed. Adding to the frustration is a quiet comparison Moscow can't ignore. Pakistan has access to Chinese military systems that Russia does not. From Moscow's perspective, that feels like being sidelined by a partner who claims neutrality but controls the supply tap. Putin is a transactional leader. He remembers who delivered and who didn't. That's why Russia will not sacrifice its relationship with India to protect China's feelings. Arms sales to India bring money, influence, and leverage. China offers stability, but not unconditional support. At the same time, Russia is not reckless. Its conflict with Europe is already deep and irreversible in the short term. Opening a second front by antagonizing China would be strategic suicide. So, Moscow walks a tightrope, deepen ties with India, maintain workable relations with China, and avoid pushing either side too far. This isn't an alliance system. It's a three-way balancing act, driven by necessity rather than trust. And that brings us to the key question everyone keeps asking. Should China be worried? To understand why China remains calm, you have to strip away the symbolism and look at capability. Russia today cannot compete in the technologies that define modern air power. High-end chips, advanced sensors, electronic warfare systems, and precision manufacturing are the backbone of fifth-generation fighters. Russia produces very little of this domestically. It relies on imports, workarounds, and older industrial processes. China, by contrast, controls large parts of these supply chains. From electronics to materials to rare earths, many of the components Russia needs either come from China or depend on Chinese production somewhere upstream. Without those inputs, advanced weapons don't just become worse, they become impossible to build at scale. Now compare the aircraft themselves. The Su-57 looks impressive in photos, but modern air combat isn't decided by looks or speed alone. It's decided by stealth coatings that actually work, radar systems that can see without being seen, and electronic warfare that blinds the opponent before the fight even begins. On those fronts, the Su-57 simply does not match the J-20 or the F-22. Its stealth shaping is less refined, its radar integration is weaker, and its electronic systems lag behind. Then factor in time. India moves slowly when it comes to defense production. Building factories, training engineers, integrating supply chains. All of this takes years. By the time India establishes Su-57 production lines and achieves real combat readiness, the regional balance will already have shifted. Pakistan is expected to field the J-35. China is developing sixth-generation platforms like the J-36 and J-50. The J-20 fleet alone is projected to approach 500 aircraft. That's why Chinese planners aren't rushing. By the time India is ready, the race will already be over. If you want to understand how this Su-57 story is likely to end, you don't need predictions. You need history. In 2004, Russia sold India a decommissioned aircraft carrier, the Admiral Gorshkov, for a symbolic price, $1. On paper, it looked like the deal of the century. India would pay only for refurbishment, upgrades, and weapons integration. What followed was almost dark comedy. The refit dragged on for years. Deadlines were missed again and again. Costs kept rising. Every new problem required more money, more negotiations, more delays. By the time the carrier was finally delivered, India had paid about $2.9 billion, more than the cost of building a brand new carrier from scratch. Russia, meanwhile, achieved something crucial. A struggling shipyard stayed alive. Thousands of workers kept their jobs. Technical skills that were on the verge of being lost were revived. One cheap Indian deal ended up rescuing an entire industrial ecosystem. That pattern matters. The Su-57 program itself started as a joint Russia-India project. India invested heavily, expecting access to core technologies. Instead, it discovered it was funding development without real control. When India pulled out in frustration, the money was already gone. The lesson is simple and, well, uncomfortable. Russia survives by monetizing India's ambition. India pays for capability it never fully owns. The dependence remains. Seen through this lens, the Su-57 offer isn't about making India stronger. It's about keeping Russian industry alive. This deal isn't really about fighters. It's about survival, Russia's survival. When you put all the pieces together, the picture becomes much clearer and much colder. Russia and India are moving closer again, not because of trust or shared values, but because their weaknesses fit each other. Russia needs money, markets, and relevance. India needs weapons it can actually buy and sustain. In that sense, they really do deserve each other. China understands this dynamic perfectly. That's why Beijing has no interest in interfering. Great powers don't panic over other people's deals. They focus on their own foundations. China's strength doesn't come from blocking others. It comes from building faster, deeper, and more independently than anyone else. This is the core of China's long game: raise its own technological and industrial ceiling, reduce reliance on unreliable partners, let rivals reveal their choices first. China doesn't need emotional alliances, it needs options. In a fragmented, multipolar world, some countries constantly shift sides, chasing short-term benefits. Others invest in staying power. China's strategy is built around a simple rule: never let an ally become a liability. and never let sentiment override structure. That's why China can calmly watch Russia sell weapons to India. That's why it can afford to wait while others rush. China isn't worried about who Russia sells weapons to. China is focused on who will still matter when the smoke clears. If you want to understand where global power is really heading, from post-Ukraine geopolitics to next-generation aircraft and the technology choke points behind them, make sure to stay tuned.